Welcome to the second video on simplifying expressions. We'll take a look at a few more complex problems. So here's the first one that I want to take a look at, right? So simplify. These are the instructions. First one is this, and so here we're going to use the distributive property. If you remember, the distributive property. To distribute this 7. So it becomes 7 times 7x plus 7 times 5. Of course, 7 times 5 is easy. That's 35. And I'm just to reiterate the properties. This I can again do using the associative property of multiplication. I can combine the two 7, think of the two 7s together and write this as 49x plus 35. And again, some of you could probably get to that answer in one step. There's nothing wrong with doing that. So this would be, I'm just going through this slowly. So right there, that's the associative property. Okay, all right. So let's do another one of these, and this time I'm going to use a negative number. So I'm going to say negative 7x minus 5. So again, this negative sometimes throws people off. Remember that this is shorthand for really negative 1. No different to the 7 we had in the previous example. And again, we will use the distributive property and say this is negative 1 times 7x minus negative 1 times 5, right? And we can, again, doing this super slowly, showing all the steps, that's negative 1 times 7x, and over here that's a negative 5 if you multiply these two, and this is a negative 7. And yes, subtract a negative is like adding a positive. You end up with that. And so the key here is to make sure that you distribute all the way through. And again, there's nothing wrong with going from that first problem step to the last answer step if you can do it in one step. But I have shown you all the intermediate steps. Let's do one more, and this time I'm going to use a fraction. So 3, example 3, and this time I'm going to go 1/4 times 3x minus 1, and it's nothing more than the distributive property again, so that's really 1/4 times 3x minus 1/4 times 1. And of course that's the identity over here on the right, so that's just simply 1/4 minus, and again here we can use the associative idea, so we can say that's 1/4 times 3x. And sometimes it's helpful to put that 1 underneath, so you sort of know who's in the numerator and who's in the denominator. And we know how to multiply fractions, and the way you multiply fractions is you first try to reduce numerator to denominator, and nothing here reduces, and then you multiply across. So that's 3/4 minus 1/4. So now that we have the basics of the distributive property under control, let's take a look at a more complex problem here. Right? So example. So this time we're going to go 8 plus 2 times 3x plus 7. So these kinds of questions involve a lot of ideas. So don't forget that the order of operations plays a role here, and the properties of numbers play a role, right? So the order of operations will tell us immediately, focus on what's inside the groups. Well, if I look inside the groups, there's nothing much I can do inside the groups. The 3x plus 7 is the group, and the group is fine. If the groups are done, the next thing we want to do is multiplication. So again, I look through and I see multiplication right here. And so I am going to go ahead and do that step. So this is the distribution step. So this is going to be 8 plus 2 times 3x plus 2 times 7. That's 14. So I did that a little fast. I hope that's okay. And we can group the 2 and the 3 together here and say that's 8 plus 6x plus 14. Now we get to the idea, now we're doing addition and subtraction, and we get to the idea of like terms. So if I scan through this whole thing here, notice that there are no the x terms except for that 6x. So the 6x has nothing to combine itself with. So I'm just going to write the 6x. However, the 8 and the 14 are like terms. So in a sense, I can switch the 8 over if we want, and what we're doing here is the commutative property, switch the x with the 6x. Commutative property, get the 8 next to the 14, and these are like terms, so we can now combine them and write that as 22, and therein is our final answer. I think we could do one more, and this time we'll reach for some fractions. So let me write it over here. Example. So here's the question. We'll throw in a negative and some fractions for good measure. So 4/5 x minus 2/3 plus x. All right. So again, order of operations, nothing I can do within those groups, followed by multiplications here because there are no exponents, of course. So multiplication is the distribution step. So again, we identify that negative sign in front as really being the number -1. Like that. And now I can do the distribution. So this becomes now -1 times 4/5 x minus -1 times 2/3 plus x. And so this is the, over here, we can again do the associative property and say this is -1 over 1 times 4/5 x, and again over here this is -1 over 1 2/3 plus x, and when you multiply, we multiply across fractions, so -1 times 4 is -4, 5 times 1 is 5x, and then over here that's a -2 over 3 plus x. And yes, you can combine those, subtract a negative, as we talked about a moment ago, is the same as adding. Right. So we've done the multiplication step. I know I took a lot of steps to get there, and that's, you can do it fast. If you can get here faster, that's fine. The problem is not done. I'm sort of putting on pause here just to tell you all this. One of the biggest mistakes that I see people do is not to distribute that negative sign to that second term, the 2/3. So be aware that when you distribute, it must go to each of the terms that are involved. So right here you see how I have distributed it all the way through to everything that was within the parentheses, like so. Okay. Alright, so now it's all additions and subtractions, and now the question is what are the like terms? So I look through this and I see two things that have x's to them. So again, if you want to, you can put them next to each other using the commutative property. So I'm going to switch the x and the 2/3 out, like so, and now I get ready to add these. So it's helpful to see like that. And I wrote that as a fraction because I want to be able to add them. So really what we're going to do is add -4/5 to 1/1. So I'm doing this off the side. I can bring the answer back in, and I hope you remember that when you add fractions, you need a common denominator. Add or subtract fractions, you need a common denominator. So in this case, the LCD is going to be 5, least common denominator is going to be 5. So 5, and so here there is no change, but I'm going to multiply this by 5 to get that 5, and this I'm going to multiply the numerator also by 5, and that gives me 5 on the top. So this then combines to 1/5. So now I can bring that answer back into my problem and say, well, that's 1/5 x plus 2/3. And there is your simplified expression.